In the middle of the 19th century, something new appears on the horizon of the Western world. Not a factory chimney, not a railway bridge, not a cathedral spire. A long, symmetrical line of windows stretching across a hillside like a palace built for no royal family. A central tower, two wings, then two more. Stone and brick so heavy it seems intended to outlast the century that produced it. And behind those windows, a population that arrives faster than the building can explain. The records call these places hospitals. Reformers called them mercy. Governments called them necessity. But when you step back and watch the pattern repeat from country to country, the rise of the asylum feels less like a medical breakthrough and more like an infrastructure project, one that spreads with an urgency that doesn't match its official tone. The story we're given is simple: humanitarian reform, moral treatment, the birth of modern psychiatry. The mad were no longer chained in cellars. They were moved into clean institutions, away from the brutality of prisons and the neglect of poorhouses. It's a comforting narrative. It sounds like progress. And yet, between the 1840s and the end of the century, enormous psychiatric complexes appear across Britain, France, Germany, the United States, and far beyond, often in places with little industry, little urban pressure, and populations too small to plausibly generate the numbers these buildings were designed to hold. That mismatch is the first crack, because the real question is not why people suffered. People have always suffered. The question is why states suddenly decided to build vast, permanent structures to contain them, and why they did it at scale, almost everywhere, within the same few decades. If you look at the buildings themselves, the ambition is startling. These are not modest wards attached to existing hospitals. They are self-contained worlds: farms, laundries, workshops, chapels, water systems, heating systems, corridors that run like arteries through stone, entire towns in one footprint, sealed behind gates. And then they fill, quickly, sometimes immediately, as if the demand had been waiting uncounted in the shadows. So where did the patients come from? The standard answers point to modern life: cities swelling, traditional families breaking apart, poverty becoming visible, alcoholism, disease, war trauma, the mental strain of industrial schedules and crowded tenements. All of it real, all of it plausible. But then you find the outliers that should not exist if this were simply an urban industrial story. Rural counties building huge asylums, provincial towns constructing institutions sized for thousands. Places with more pasture than pavement financing buildings that look like they were planned for an invisible city. If the asylum boom was a response to industry, why do so many of these institutions rise far from the worst industrial centers, on quiet hillsides, in countryside chosen specifically for isolation? That isolation is always explained as therapy: fresh air, calm scenery, distance from temptation. But it also creates another effect: removal, a way to take a person out of the public record without needing a prison sentence. And the mid-1800s are an era that suddenly becomes very interested in removal. This is where the story grows darker, not because it requires a secret master plan, but because it reveals how easily a society can expand the category of unfit when it has a place to put them. Before the 1840s, insanity in the public imagination often meant something obvious: violent confusion, severe cognitive collapse, behavior so disruptive it could not be ignored. Families hid relatives at home, or the poor ended up in workhouses and jails. It was ugly, but the category was narrow. Then within a few decades, the category stretches. New diagnoses appear, some thoughtful, some vague, some clearly reflecting social anxieties more than clinical insight: moral insanity, melancholia, monomania, conditions defined less by hallucination and more by failing to behave correctly. Women institutionalized for refusing domestic roles, men committed for drinking, people confined for idleness, stubbornness, excitability, sexual impropriety, religious excess, or simply being unmanageable. The asylum did not merely treat mental illness. It gave administrators a legal and physical mechanism to handle social problems that did not fit elsewhere. And once that mechanism exists, it is used. Britain's lunacy reforms in the 1840s did more than express compassion. They created administrative obligations and inspection regimes. Counties were expected to provide institutional accommodation. When governments mandate buildings appear. In the United States, the same momentum arrives through a different route: state-by-state legislation, reform campaigns, and a rising belief that the state could engineer moral improvement through institutions. Campaigners described jails filled with the mentally ill, and in many places they were right. But the solution offered was not community care. It was relocation into massive, centralized facilities. This looks at first glance like convergence. Different societies confronting similar problems, adopting similar solutions. Yet the timing still nags. The rapid spread, the similarity of layouts, the repeating logic: isolate, classify, contain, reform. And then there is the architecture. Some 19th century psychiatric hospitals were built according to highly influential design philosophies: symmetry, ventilation, sunlight, separation of patients by type. In North America, the Kirkbride Plan becomes an emblem of the era. Its long wings intended to create orderly gradients from calm to disturbed. In Europe, pavilion designs and later radial plans serve similar aims. On paper, it is rational. In stone, it is monumental. Which raises another question. Why did mental health, still poorly understood, still debated, receive buildings as grand as civic palaces? Part of the answer is grimly practical. These institutions were expected to function as permanent storage. If you assume people will stay for decades, you do not build a small ward. You build a fortress that can operate as a closed system with its own labor force, its own food supply, and minimal need for outside services. And many patients did stay for decades. The asylum promised cure. The reality often became indefinite confinement. Here the pattern gets sharper. In many places, admissions rose faster than discharge. Once built, the institutions created their own justification. Overcrowding led to calls for expansion. Expansion led to more admissions. More admissions led to overcrowding again. A self-feeding loop, not necessarily planned, but structurally inevitable. Yet even this doesn't fully explain the speed with which these institutions filled, or the thinness of what remains behind. Because if you try to follow the human trail, the patient trail, you often hit a wall. There are case books, admission registers, physician notes, but the voice of the patient is faint. Letters are filtered, diaries are rare. Testimony often survives only through a doctor's interpretation, translated into symptoms and categories. This is not always deliberate suppression, it is the nature of bureaucratic medicine. The institution speaks in forms, not in stories. Still, the absence matters. When you build an entire world for thousands of people, you would expect a flood of personal writing, family correspondence, complaints, court appeals, detailed records of lives interrupted. Instead, you find gaps, partial files, anonymous admissions. People defined only by the moment they entered the gate. And then, in the 20th century, when many of these institutions closed, another silence descends. Records were lost to fire, water, neglect, disposal, privacy restrictions, or simple indifference. Some were destroyed because they were considered obsolete, some were scattered, some remain sealed. So the human evidence thins even further, and the buildings become the loudest witnesses, which is why alternative explanations thrive here. The less we can hear the people, the more we stare at the stones. One of the most provocative theories claims the asylums were not primarily medical at all, that they served as a mechanism to remove witnesses to a disrupted past. People whose memories didn't fit the new official story. The idea is dramatic and it gains traction because it offers a single cause for several strange facts. Rapid construction, massive capacity, thin records, and the way delusion can be used to delegitimize inconvenient testimony. But there is a problem. The theory depends on an enormous event that mainstream history does not document in the way such an event would normally be documented. It also assumes that states across rival nations coordinated a quiet global campaign of memory management at precisely the moment they were struggling with revolutions, wars, and internal instability. That level of coordination is difficult to prove, and the lack of proof is not by itself proof of concealment. And yet, you don't need a secret global agreement to create a system that functions like one. You only need shared incentives. Consider what the 19th century actually was: an era of displacement at scale. War and political repression in Europe created waves of refugees. The collapse of old rural economies pushed people into cities and into migration. Famine did the same. Epidemics moved through populations repeatedly. Industrial accidents and chemical exposures increased. Alcohol became both coping mechanism and public panic. Syphilis and other infections caused psychiatric symptoms. Lead and other toxins were common. Brain injuries from labor and warfare were frequent. And medical understanding of all this was limited. Now add the administrative revolution of the era, the modern state learning to count, categorize, and manage populations. Census taking expands, registration systems strengthen, policing becomes more systematic. Poor laws and settlement laws define who belongs where. Bureaucracies discover that naming a problem gives it shape, and that giving it shape allows funding. In that environment, people who once would have remained in families, in villages, in informal networks are suddenly visible as cases. The asylum becomes a place where multiple anxieties can be deposited under one label: insanity, not just hallucination, also poverty, also homelessness, also alcoholism, also disability, also domestic conflict, also political inconvenience sometimes, also women who didn't conform, also men who couldn't work, also immigrants who didn't fit, also trauma that had no language. Once you see it that way, the question, where did the patients come from, changes. They didn't appear out of nowhere. They were reclassified out of society. But why the identical surge? Why the compressed timeline? Because the mid-1800s are also when institutional thinking becomes fashionable. Not only asylums, prisons, workhouses, orphanages, reform schools, hospitals, barracks. The era builds containers for people, believing that containment can produce order. It's a worldview, not a conspiracy. Still, the unsettling part remains. The system can hide dissent without needing to identify it as dissent. If someone insists the world used to be different, streets lower, buildings altered, history inconsistent, one does not need a global plan to silence them. One simply needs a cultural consensus that such claims are symptoms. Once medicine gains authority, disagreement can be reframed as disorder. And the 19th century is exactly when medicine begins to claim that authority over the mind. So the alternative theory is not persuasive because it is literally true in every detail. It is persuasive because it points to a real mechanism: the medicalization of inconvenient experience. You can institutionalize a person for being dangerous, and it looks like punishment. You can institutionalize them for being mad, and it looks like care. That ambiguity is powerful, and it becomes more powerful when diagnostic language expands. When false memory, confabulation, temporal disorientation, and other terms appear, they can be used responsibly, or they can be used lazily. Without patient voices, it's hard to know which. There is another architectural detail that deserves attention here because it keeps reappearing if you visit old institutional sites. Lower levels that feel older than the rest. Basement windows that look like ground floor windows. Entrances that seem misaligned with the current grade. Like many 19th century buildings, asylums often underwent renovations, expansions, regrading, and landscaping over time. That alone can explain a lot. But in some cases, the impression is stronger. A sense that the building has been adjusted to a new ground reality, not designed cleanly from scratch. This is where researchers who are already focused on buried city layers start connecting the two stories. They see a parallel: buried architecture in cities and massive institutions rising as if prepared for a population shift. The temptation is to merge them into one narrative: a catastrophe, then a cleanup, then containment for the witnesses. It is a compelling story. It feels like it explains the eerie scale, the silence, the missing voices. Yet a compelling story is not the same as a tested one. What we can say more safely is this: the asylum boom sits at the intersection of three forces that would naturally produce something massive, synchronized, and morally ambiguous. First, the rise of the modern state, eager to manage populations through institutions. Second, the upheavals of the 19th century, migration, poverty, disease, trauma, creating large numbers of people who didn't fit the machinery of industrial life. Third, the growing authority of medicine, offering a socially acceptable language for removing those people from public view. Add these together, and you don't need to invent patience. You create them administratively. And once you build the walls fill. The final detail is the one that lingers longest. What happened afterward? By the late 19th century, many asylums were already overcrowded. Moral treatment gave way to custodial care. The promise of cure faded into routine. Restraints returned in subtler forms. Patient labor sustained the institutions. The asylum, meant to represent enlightened progress, became a long corridor of quiet endings. Then in the 20th century, the system collapses again. New drugs, new policies, deinstitutionalization, scandals, closures. The same buildings that once symbolized compassion become symbols of neglect. They empty, rot, and are demolished or repurposed, and with them go the archives. So we are left with stone shells and partial files, trying to reconstruct a human catastrophe from administrative fragments. Which brings the question back, not as an accusation, but as a lingering suspicion. Were these places built to heal or to disappear? The honest answer may be that they were built to do both. They were built by people who believed they were doing good and operated by systems that discovered how useful containment could be. They were shaped by fear of disorder as much as fear of illness. They absorbed every kind of unwanted life and called it madness, because madness was the one category broad enough to hold what society didn't know how to face. If there were witnesses to something history failed to integrate, whether a local disaster, a personal trauma, a political rupture, or a sudden reshaping of the physical city, those witnesses would have been vulnerable in exactly the way institutions exploit. They would be disbelieved first, then classified, not because a hidden committee ordered it, but because the machinery was already built to make it happen. And that may be the more unsettling conclusion. A civilization doesn't always need to erase the past by burning libraries or banning speech. Sometimes it only needs a place to put the people who won't stop remembering differently. A gate on a hill, a long row of windows, a ledger with thin ink, and a word that can turn testimony into symptom.